Thank you for joining me for another episode of Stories from Our Past. If you or someone you know has a story from our past and we need to know it, hear it, or learn from it, please send your inquiry to columbusblackhistory.org. Thank you for listening. I'm your local historian, Rita Fuller-Yates, and I thank you for allowing me to share your story with the world. Today on Stories from Our Past, I sat down with two amazing women who moved to Columbus, Ohio as young girls with their families. Darlene Harp and T. Graves lived the perfect examples of families who moved from the South to experience better opportunities in the North. They call it the Great Migration. The Great Migration was one of the most significant movements of people in United States history. Approximately 6 million Black people moved from the American South to Midwestern states like Columbus, roughly from the 1910s until the 1970s. Once the families arrived, many lived in segregated communities of Columbus, on the east side of Columbus, hilltops, or possibly farms that would later become suburbs. Let's sit down and hear from Mrs. Harp and Mrs. Graves and learn how the incredible migration journey affected their families and what growth did their families experience after moving.
I am from Mississippi, and I was born in a place called Hernando's, Mississippi. And I moved to live with my great-grandfather, who lived in Olive Branch, Mississippi. And there I grew up watching them grow farm. We lived on a farm there.
My grandmother decided to move to Ohio. She fell in love with this gentleman. My mother at the time was a junior in high school, and she was not happy with the prospect of moving and not getting to finish her senior year with her friends. Her best friend was Fannie Merriweather, and they were just devastated. My grandmother said, well, I'll let you stay in Tuscaloosa and finish your senior year.
Who did she stay with?
She was going to stay with her friend, Fannie Merriweather, and her family. And they were excited about that. But at the last minute, my grandmother changed her mind and said, no, I want you to come with me. And so this was very devastating to them, but they had no choice. So I do have a letter that Fannie Merriweather wrote in 1938 to my mother, and my mother saved it all this time, and she expressed, how sad she was about my mother leaving. And my mother moved to Willard, Ohio. She and my grandmother started attending a church, and my mother played the piano. So my father at the time, he was attending Wilberforce University, and they heard that there was a new girl in town who was going to this church, and they decided to come to church and try to check her out. So my father's best friend really liked the way she looked and, thought that he wanted to date her. But he didn't know how to get in touch with her. So he had my father write a letter to her. My father was a very good writer. And my mother got the letter, and I think they might have gone on one date. But my mother wasn't really, too excited about him. But after several letters, my mother realized that it was my father who was actually writing the letters. And he started liking her too, because he got the letters from her and had to answer them. So they started dating, and they ended up getting married.
Well, my great-grandfather was the first freeborn to live on the land, and And my grandfather was the second generation, and of course my mom was the third generation to live on that land and to actually work there and be free, to sell their products, Yeah.
So they started out being enslaved on that land, but they ended up buying the
Yes,
land.
And of course, it was my great-great-grandmother who bought the land. And so I'm kind of proud of that because she was an entrepreneur,
Do
So
you
she
still
did-
own the land today? Does
We
your
still
family?
own it today, but sadly, the family is going to let it go this year. They're in the process of selling. It's been in the family for close to 200 years.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's something that I'm really proud of, that these men and women were able to hold on to land that long. And it's kind of unusual because many of us were not able to keep our land. It was either taken or we taxed it out, didn't pay the taxes on it.
Right.
But they were able to muscle up that money and pay the taxes. And so we kept it for close to 200 years.
I love that story.
Yeah.
So tell me about, again, legacy is built 200 years, or at least 150 at the time.
Yeah.
What made your family move to little old Columbus?
Little old Columbus, my mom wanted an education for her children. That was her main objective,
So they didn't have good education opportunities
No, not
in Mississippi?
Not in the area where I live, because this was a rural area and the schools were so far away and there were no buses and we literally had to walk miles to get to school, and you're going into neighborhoods that are not safe, and many times we had dogs sicked on us, and so my mom knew that we were of age where she needed to give us an education, and so we came to Columbus, Ohio.
After my mother graduated from school in Willard, Ohio, she went back down south to go to Stillman. And my father ended up, after he graduated from Wilberforce, he got drafted because that was World War II.
Mm-hmm.
But before he went into the service, they did get together and get married. And meanwhile, my grandmother living in Willard, the husband that she came to Willard to marry died. So she had relatives in Columbus, Ohio, so she ended up coming to Columbus. And after my mother graduated from Stillman, she came to Columbus also to live with my grandmother, and she was working at Tyler Drug Store.
Okay.
Yes, and they lived on Mount Vernon Avenue. And of course, when my father got back from the service, they all moved to the hilltop. And I can remember my father wanting to buy a house on the hilltop. He went to the bank and they told him, well, you can buy, we will find mortgage, you can get a mortgage for a house, but it has to be on the south side of Broad Street. And he wasn't allowed to get a mortgage on the north side of Broad Street because that was all a white area.
So they was restricting where he could use his GI Bill.
Right,
So
exactly.
he could use it, but then they defined where he could
Exactly.
use the
Right.
bill for. Okay.
Mhm.
So tell me a little bit about once you arrived you didn't arrive, but do you know what your parents did for a living?
Well, like I said, my mother worked at Tyler Drug Store, and my father ended up working for the Army. I think I can't remember the name of the place, but then he ended up going to North American Aviation. And my mother also got a job at North American Aviation, and a lot of people from the hilltop worked there. And I remember finding one of my mother's pay stubs, and for a 40-hour week, she earned $85.
Wow.
And that was considered good money because, I mean, a loaf of bread cost 15 cents at that time, and so.
What was your address on the hilltop?
Okay, my address was 32 South Oakley.
Okay, so and that was a segregated community on the west side.
Right, and there were a lot of people moving from the south, a lot of families. I lived right next door to Lawrence Carter, and he's Dr. Carter, who was here and spoke at I think when the teachers have the Board of Education has big breakfast in January, Reverend Carter spoke. And
Okay.
he grew up on the hilltop.
Okay.
Yes,
So he was your friend?
Yeah, well, he was older, but you know, we talked over the fence. Behind me lived Ming Smith.
God,
Ming
the
Smith
artist.
is the artist. We grew up together, and I go to see her in New York all the time, and we've remained friends. She comes to Columbus, and I think she's going to have an exhibition here in a
Please
couple.
let me know.
I will.
I would
And
love to
she has
support.
work at MoMA too, Metropolitan Museum of Art.
Okay.
Yes.
We've shared her story, and she's been very complimentary in response. So again, that's always a good thing to know, is that I have a connector.
Right,
That's
right.
always
And you
nice.
had a picture of us in your first book, and it was a party on the hilltop.
Yeah.
Remember? And Ming was there with her sister. Yeah, that was at 32 South Oakland.
And you were in the photo?
Yes.
I didn't even see. I love
Yes.
those moments like that, because I don't always know the details of the
Right.
people
Right.
that we're highlighting.
We moved to the west side of Columbus, which today is called Franklinton. Yes, and from what I gathered, it's one of the first settlements in Ohio.
It is the first village
Yeah,
in the county.
that's right.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
yes.
established in 1797.
Yeah. Nice little integrated community, you know.
I can't
The
believe it.
schools
I've
were-
never heard of a
yeah.
black person going. So where did you go to middle school or junior high
I
school?
went to middle school. It was Avondale Elementary School. And from there, I graduated to Starling Junior High School.
Well, talk a couple of minutes about you growing up in Franklinton in junior high school in an integrated community and how the community worked together.
Well, as I mentioned, earlier, we did have friends that were of different nationalities, and we got along very well. Yeah,
I think that is so unique. It's against the grain
it is.
of what it is that people always hear about integrated
Uh-huh.
communities, especially in the 60s.
In the 60s,
In the
and the
60s.
thing that I found that was so wonderful, I could actually walk to school and not have someone put their dogs on us, and I could go alone, and I felt really safe.
Love it.
Safe, and looking at the people who lived with me or lived around me, they were not of my color, but they were of different color, so I was really happy to go to school every day.
Love
Every
it.
single day I went to school, and if we missed a day, they had what they call truant officers, and they'll come knocking on your door, and they want to know, where are your children? It is against the law in the state of Ohio to not send your children to school every day. So that was an opportunity for me to get into school every single day.
Love it.
And I rarely ever missed a day, because I loved it so much,
Yeah, we don't hear those stories too often about the communities getting working together.
Yes.
Yeah, I love that. So then you left the hilltop and or I should say the west side.
The west side, and moved to the east side.
And moved to the east side. Where did you move to?
We moved to Morrison in the Franklin Park areas where we lived. Right in
Okay, so your house got bigger.
The house got bigger, the neighborhood was bigger, and I saw lots of people that looked like me.
Now, did you have any culture shock with that? Because you almost moved from a small pocket.
Small pocket, yes.
And
it was, because I never saw that many African Americans in one setting, just in a school system alone. And you walk outside and you see all of these people, and they all look like me, So it was definitely a culture shock, yes.
now, where did you end up going to high school once you moved?
I went to Monroe Junior High School, and then I went from Monroe to East High School.
Okay.
And this is where I met some of the most wonderful people in my life.
So you're a tiger.
Yeah, Tiger, yes.
All
All
right.
the way.
All right. All right. I should have known when you sat down. So tell me a little bit about that experience. What year did you arrive at
That year,
East High School?
yeah, that was during the year of Jack Gibbs' years, and we had a lot of things going on in that school. Probably won all the championships, and the art department, of course, was a great place for me to be because, I had Mrs. Butler as an art instructor. And I had a lot of my work on exhibit there, and that's where I got my first taste of actually creating work that could be out in the public, So A couple of times I won the showcase. You know, if you win the showcase, you're doing it, you know.
Well, they don't know anything about that yet.
Yeah.
We haven't talked about what makes you an amazing artist or what the development of that has been since childhood. So, outside of moving here during the Great Migration and your family finding a home in Franklinton,
Yes.
you learned a unique talent as a child. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, my grandmother always made things, you know. I mean, we had to make everything, you know, your brooms, you know, we didn't consider that art, but I do know today that there are people who make brooms and they are considered an art form, you know. I mean, she would have to go out and gather the, you know, the weeds and things to make these brooms. And of course, made her soap, she made everything. And the quilts, everything was made by hand, you know. And so that is where I got my love for the textiles, you know, working with textiles, yes.
So that's your genre of art,
That's my
is
genre of
textiles.
art, but I can do other things.
I felt the segregation going to school at West High School and going to, excuse me, going to, things were just different. My friend Annette Beatty Jefferson, who just passed away.
Sorry to hear.
Yes, she was instrumental in, you know, I grew up with her. She was a good friend of mine, and she was a Westcott, and they were, it's like a little marching band, marching group of girls. And most of the officers, the school officers, all of them, they were all white, you know. We kind of were on the outskirts of school, and we hung around together. We walked to school from Oakley Avenue all the way to West High School through snow, rain, you know, there were no busing issues or anything like that. So we all walked to school together.
So did you did you want to go to East High School?
Oh my goodness,
or Linden,
yes.
or the black school?
Yes, we loved East. And when East came to West High School to play football, we would all sit on the east side, you know.
See, I love the authenticity of that, because to me, if I was in the school like West High School, although you wasn't secluded from black people, it was very small pockets.
Exactly.
And to experience a pocket versus a whole school that is relatable to you, everything is about you, you're the leader, you are the school.
Right.
I think it just rains confidence, you know what I mean?
Right. And you know, there were friends, you know, I knew people who went to East. My friend June Alston, who was Fanny's daughter, and I stayed friends, you know, we were together a lot, and she would tell me about the different events that they were having at school and things that she was a part of, and it kind of, you know, I'm like, oh, well, okay, sounds like fun. But
We live and learn, right?
Right.
So tell me about Fanny, and do you remember growing up with her as a little girl and the family getting a lot of attention, or what did you know about them when you were growing up?
Well, when I first remember June and Harvey, they lived on Hildreth. Then they moved to Greenway South, and they lived there. And we always loved to come and visit.
I bet.
Because Harvey had a basement with all these trains. And we were just fascinated by the trains, but of course he wouldn't let us touch them, you know, of course. But
were they moving trains?
Oh yes,
Oh,
electric
wow.
trains, yes. And we enjoyed coming to visit. And my grandmother, of course, lived on Winter Avenue, and so we you know, visited the east side, and we knew, you know, a lot about the east side.
Did you
And
go
it
to church
was
on
different.
the west side?
I went to a church on the hilltop, yes, Wheatland Avenue Methodist Church,
Okay.
and now it's Hilltop Methodist.
Okay.
But all of our activities were around church. Like on Halloween, there would be a Halloween party, and a lot of activities. Then as I grew older, we had the Methodist Youth Fellowship, and my mother was a part of that. We went horseback riding, we went on picnics, we went to the beach, we did a lot of things through the church. That was our main activity.
Yeah, it seemed that era that was very popular to be included in a church, and that was your community.
Yes.
I knew that even as a black person because in Columbus, you were almost affiliated with your church.
Yes.
And I was black, but I went to Catholic church.
Right.
We were Catholic. And I'll never forget always feeling different when I would tell black people that I was Catholic. It was almost like, oh.
Right. Right. And one of my best friends, Sylvia Pruitt was her name. She also she was Catholic. She went to a Catholic, but her family wasn't. She decided on her own to go and join St. Aloysius Church.
Oh.
And I can
Wow.
remember her asking me sometimes, she said she wanted me to come with her to different activities. And I'm like, okay, I'll come. But then I'd I'd say, oh, my mother wouldn't let me or something like that.
Yeah, it was a little uncomfortable
Yes,
for people.
yes, and it did make a difference, you know, that she wasn't always included in the activities that we had.
Okay, so in high school, what form of art did you start with?
Clay.
Clay.
Yes, clay.
Clay.
You like clay?
Clay.
Yes, clay.
Okay. What would you normally make out of clay?
Statues, you know, of the human anatomy, that sort of thing, yes.
And then clay evolved
into textiles. Textiles going back because I became allergic to the clay. And so I had to transition back into what my grandmother and my great-grandmother did, you know, which is working with textiles, you know.
Well, you know, I always say when God calls you to something, He's going to take away what doesn't work. So sometimes He just didn't want you to do clay. He going to get His way. so you picked up textiles.
Textiles, yeah.
And now you create what out of textiles?
What I create out of textiles is various forms. You know, I draw designs on fabric and then go back in and do the needlework, you know, embroidery and those kinds of things. And actually telling a story, you know, of the places where I was born, you know. Hernando's, you know, in Clarkdale, Mississippi, those places, you know. And so my theme right now is the blues. So I've created an entire collection of blues images, you know, guitars, various parts of the guitar, acoustics, and you know, the little juke joints where they, you know, practice their crafts, you know. So yeah.
Did you use the same technique that you learned from your grandmother?
Only thing I'm doing different that my grandmother didn't do is applique. Creating designs and then stitching them onto the fabric with thread and also with embroidery threads as well. Yeah.
So I'm not a seamstress. So
right.
What is the difference between what did she do versus how you do it?
My grandmother did patch quilts. I mean, this was like, they call it strip quilting. She would just tear strips of fabrics up and then sew them back together.
Oh, yeah, I've seen that. That's why it looks...
pattern. Yes.
Okay, so now what do you do in comparison?
And what I do, I will draw a design and then place it on top of a whole piece of fabric.
Got it.
And you're going to have the image of a person or, you know, structure of a house or a dog or something of that nature.
And then you stitch it in.
I stitch it in, yeah.
Got it, got it. So that's a modern way.
Yeah, that's a modern way of doing it, but also going back and picking up some of my grandmother's strip quilting, you know, and then also putting a pattern on top of that, which could be a cutout of a figure or it could be a house or something of that nature, depending on the story that I'm telling.
So you can use both
of them, yes.
Applications to do.
Yeah,
your
you don't throw
quilting.
away the old strip quilting technique, you know. You have to take that with you.
I love it. Now, are your siblings artists as well?
Well, the one that was an artist that I thought was going to really be a great artist was my young brother Jerry, but he was murdered at the age of 16. So he was on his way to becoming a great artist and looking at Columbus College of Arts and Design as his place of study, you know. And he was a student at East High School as well. And that's one of the reasons I took on this business of being an artist, is to tell the story that I think he would have told. And because I wanted him to do his work, and I said, well, if you do it, then I will sponsor you and I will make sure that you have a place to exhibit your work. But I lost him, you know. So when I thought, well, maybe I can continue his story, you know, and the story that I tell is basically his story that I think he would have told had he lived.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
So I love this. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
So let's talk. Do I have permission to talk about him?
Yes,
Okay. So where did he fall in line
a sculptor.
as far as the siblings?
Okay, he was like the seventh.
The seventh. Okay.
No, the eighth.
So you were older sister.
Much older, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, much older. I was his big sister.
Big sister. So you were in his 20s when he was a teenager. You were in your 20s.
Yes.
He went to East High School.
Attended East High School.
What's his name?
Jerry.
Jerry.
Jerry
Okay.
Lee.
Jerry.
Lee. Jerry Lee.
Jerry Lee.
Malone.
Okay, I like that. Okay. So can you tell me a little bit about Jerry?
Very outgoing, very handsome. I mean, he walked in a room, you knew he was there because you could tell that he was a wonderful spirit, and very creative. And that was one of the reasons why I promoted him, and I wanted him to do his best, to become the artist that I knew he could be. And so I lived right in back of East High School, and so whenever he came home from school, he would stop by and share his work with me.
Y'all were the two artists of the family.
Yes, and so his first piece, I bought it. And he was so excited that I had bought his first piece. He said, gee, I'm going to go back and make a lot more. But then that fall, I lost him.
So when did you graduate from West?
I graduated from West in, a long time ago, in the 60s.
Okay.
And
any aha moments of good and bad, or anything you think is necessary for the next generation to know about growing up at West?
Things have changed quite a bit, and it's just hard, to picture, the way things were when I went to school and the way things were when my kids went to school.
Give me one good example so they can understand what you're saying.
I guess, okay, for one thing, now they have snow days. If it snows a lot, school's closed. They didn't have snow days then. We still had to trudge and walk through the snow to get to school. And when I told my kids that, they say, oh, it's a snow day. I said, well, we didn't have snow days. And they were just surprised. We had to go to school, even in the snow, no buses. And sometimes if someone's father or mother gave their child a ride to school, we would all try to climb in the car, hang on the back of it, and there might be 10 kids in that car trying to get a ride to school. But that's one difference. No snow days.
So tell me a little bit about what life was. Where did you raise your children at?
Okay. My children were raised partly in Buffalo, New York. When I got married to my first husband, we moved. I was at Ohio State University, and I had 3 years of college, but he wanted to move to California because he wanted to have a music career. His sister got married, and her husband got a job in California, and her husband said, well, I'll get a job for him too. So we moved, we just drove to California. The music career didn't work out. So I found out about Teacher Corps, which was a teacher training program that if you had 3 years of college, they would give you your final year and a master's. And this was to educate, it was to give people experience working with children who lived in ghettos and all that. So I applied for the position thinking I would get a job in San Francisco. However, I got a job in Buffalo, New York. They approved, my application. So we moved to Buffalo. And at the time, that was like 73, something like that, 74. My kids grew up in Buffalo, New York.
Okay, so you didn't move back here till?
I moved back here in 1986. I moved back to Columbus.
And you have 2 children?
Yes.
I was taking some classes at Columbus College of Arts and Design and decided, well, this is not where I belong, so I decided to just come back to the community, And this is where I was able to come in contact with men like Rowan Johnson, Kojo, Walt Neal, is said, Joe Howard, just a lot of male artists are out there actually doing art. And I was just so blown away at the idea of the generation of artists that lived in this community, creating art, and each artist was representing their own time period in which they grew up, the 40s and the 50s. So I could go into an artist's studio, and I could sit and read a Citizen Journal or a Columbus Dispatch that was printed back in 1942, So that to me was just like walking, I thought I was in heaven, because you could find all these things, in these artists' studios. And then I could go into another artist's studio and I could see this artist just painting on the floor. The canvas, don't even have it stretched, but it's on the floor, and he's just throwing paint on the floor and images coming out. You can actually see the image that he just got back from Africa, and he's painting this image of Africa, Those are the type of artists that was in this community, It was just Amina Robinson, wonderful artist. That was like Pepper Johnson, she's a ceramist, and she's making clay pots, and just doing all kinds of things, And then there was guys like Smokey Brown, Laverne Brown, all of these artists, all in this community.
My mother and father both passed away now, but they gave us a very lovely childhood.
I guess, how did it feel to have educated parents at such a unique time in America?
There were a lot of educated people who lived on the hilltop.
Say it again.
A lot of educated people who lived on the
Say
hilltop.
It louder.
Rosa Trigg lived right down the street from me, and she taught school. Clenzo Fox was a member of our church. He was educated. There were a lot of educated people who lived on the hilltop.
Well, I think that the misconception, there was a lot of educated black people who lived in Columbus.
Right.
And that's what we showcase now, because I was in shock.
Mm-hmm.
Growing up on Long Street, I thought this was basically how black people lived, unless you had a couple of spots in the suburb, what I mean?
And I think that is the one thing that we have to keep alive, is the culture of a people. That is so important, It doesn't matter what part of the country you come from, but to have that culture and to know that that culture can speak through all the pain that you're going to encounter. You're going to encounter pain. Don't ever think that you're going to escape it. It's called real pain, R-E-E-L. You're going to experience that. We all do. But you have to find a way to cope with that so that you can continue to live and to create, especially if you're an artist. You must continue to create the work, whether it be through written, whether it be through drama, whatever it is that you're doing, that work must continue, because the story must be told, and then we must become a people who can understand the value of that work. That if you discard it, and this is what I've been finding out living in this community, that so many of the people who have contributed to this community, works end up in the trash can. And I'm getting calls from people, do you know this artist? Yes, I know that artist. Well, I found this work in the trash can. Do you know this artist? Yes, I do know that artist. Stuff's in the trash can. But these are people who are photographers, they're painters, and they are the ones who are giving us the gift. And that we must become wise enough to understand that it is a gift and that we must protect it,
As I concluded my conversation with Darlene and T, I noticed that these fantastic ladies, although through different paths, found a way to call Columbus home. From their different communities on the hilltop in Franklinton to their experiences in Bronzeville, they both shared the strength of family and community. These ladies and their family's story helps to shape the story of the Great Migration and how Black people journeyed from the South to the beautiful city of Columbus. I'm so happy we can use history as a tool to share our story while helping to preserve our history. Now, thank you for joining me for another episode of Stories from Our Past.